Swiss A220-300 cockpit arrival in fog at Milan Malpensa. You need to divert this aircraft immediately, Captain. I have a board meeting in Milan that cannot be missed. Mr. Hartman, I'm flying this airplane based on safety, not your schedule. The words hung in the cockpit air like ice crystals. Captain Elena Marchetti kept her eyes fixed on the instruments before her, watching the altitude tape wind down through 800 feet. Outside the windscreen of Swiss International Airlines Flight LX1630, there was nothing but gray. Not clouds, not mist, but the kind of thick, impenetrable fog that turned Milan Malpensa Airport into a ghost field. The runway should have been visible by now. It wasn't. Approach, Swiss 1630, we're at minimums and no visual contact, Elena transmitted, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. The enhanced vision system on the A220-300's primary flight display showed a ghostly green outline of the terrain below, but even that cutting-edge technology could barely penetrate the soup they were descending into. First Officer Thomas Weber, 20 years her junior, glanced at her with barely concealed anxiety. His hand hovered over the thrust levers, ready to execute a go-around the instant she gave the word. In the cabin behind them, 137 passengers waited, unaware of just how close they were to missing this landing entirely. But Elena knew something they didn't. Among those passengers was someone who couldn't afford to miss this arrival. Someone whose life depended on touching down in Milan within the next 10 minutes. The radio crackled. Swiss 1630, Malpensa Tower, RVR now at 300 meters, CAT III conditions. You are cleared for ILS approach runway 35 right. Be advised, you are our last attempt before we close the field. Last attempt. The words carried weight. Behind them, 3 other aircraft had already diverted to Bergamo and Linate. If Elena couldn't get this Airbus A220-300 on the ground in the next 90 seconds, they'd be heading to Zurich with fuel running low and a medical emergency brewing in seat 23C. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Elena Marchetti had walked through the crew briefing room at Zurich Airport, her captain's uniform crisp despite the early morning hour. "Morning, Captain," the dispatcher greeted her, sliding the flight paperwork across the desk. "You've got a straightforward one today. Zurich to Milan Malpensa, LX1630, scheduled departure 6:45, arrival 7:55. Weather's a bit dodgy at Milan, but should stay above minimums." Elena studied the meteorological reports with the practiced eye of someone who had been flying for 34 years. The TAF for Malpensa showed fog developing after 700 but forecast to remain at 400 meters visibility, well above their approach minimums of 200 meters. She'd flown into Milan hundreds of times. It was practically her second home. "Looks manageable," she said, signing the release. "What's the load?" "Full boat, 137 souls on board. We've got a few connections, a couple of business travelers, and..." The dispatcher paused, checking his screen. "1 medical priority passenger. Non-stretcher but flagged by our operations center. Elderly woman traveling alone has an appointment at San Rafael Hospital this morning. Compassionate fare." Elena felt a familiar pull in her chest. Her own mother had made similar trips in her final years, traveling for specialized treatments, each journey a small act of courage wrapped in fear and hope. "I'll make sure we get her there on time," she said quietly. First Officer Thomas Weber arrived moments later, his flight bag slung over one shoulder. Thomas was efficient, methodical, and still carried the eagerness of someone with only 1,500 hours on the A220. He'd been assigned to Elena for his line training completion, and she'd grown to appreciate his attention to detail, even if he sometimes checked the same switch 3 times. "Morning, Captain Marchetti," he said with a slight German accent. "I've done the walk around. Aircraft is clean, no deferrals, APU is running. Beautiful machine, this A220. She smiled. The Airbus A220-300, formerly the Bombardier C-Series, was indeed a remarkable aircraft. Quiet, efficient, with a cockpit that felt more like a modern business jet than a narrow-body airliner. The Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan engines gave them exceptional fuel economy, and the fly-by-wire controls made it responsive and predictable. Elena had transitioned to the type 2 years ago and had fallen in love with it immediately. "Let's get her ready to go," Elena said, gathering her charts and iPad. "Weather might get interesting at Milan." They walked through the jet bridge to aircraft HBJCQ, where senior flight attendant Maria Rossini was already briefing her cabin crew. Maria had been flying for Swiss since before it was Swiss back in the Swiss Air days that older aviation professionals spoke of with a mixture of pride and melancholy. She was 56, with silver streaking her dark hair, and possessed the kind of unflappable competence that came from handling everything from medical emergencies to unruly passengers to emergency evacuations. "Elena!" Maria greeted her warmly as the pilots entered. They'd flown together dozens of times, had shared coffees in layover hotels from Geneva to Athens, had become friends in the way that crew members do when they trust each other's judgment completely. "Full house today. We've got the medical priority in 23C Mrs. Giuliana Tedesco, 78 years old. She's traveling alone to Milan for a cardiac consultation. Very sweet lady, a bit nervous about the flight." "I'll make it smooth for her," Elena promised, continuing forward to the cockpit. The A220's flight deck was bathed in the blue glow of the electronic displays. She settled into the left seat, the captain's seat, and felt the familiar sense of purpose settle over her shoulders like a well-worn coat. Thomas was already running through the pre-flight checks, his fingers dancing across the overhead panel. "Hydraulic pressure good, pneumatics normal, flight controls check." Elena activated her displays, watching the system's pages populate with green indicators. She programmed the flight management system with their route, a simple 40-minute hop that would take them south over the Alps, descending into the Po Valley and Milan Malpensa's runway 35 right. The weather radar showed clear skies along the route, but she noticed a gray mass developing over the Milan area. "Thomas, pull up the latest METAR for Malpensa," she requested. He typed quickly on the multi-function display. "Just came in 3 minutes ago. Visibility 1,200 meters in mist, ceiling 400 feet, temperature dew point spread only 1 degree. That's getting tight." Elena frowned. 1 degree between temperature and dew point meant saturation was imminent. When that gap closed to 0, fog would develop rapidly. "Let's keep an eye on it. Make sure we have Linate and Bergamo programmed as alternates." As passengers boarded, Elena could hear the usual sounds filtering forward. Rolling suitcases, overhead bins clicking shut, the flight attendants greeting people with multilingual efficiency. Then a voice, loud and demanding, cut through the ambient noise. "This is unacceptable. I specifically requested seat 3A and you've put someone else there." Maria's patient voice responded, too quiet to make out the words, but Elena could imagine the practiced smile, the diplomatic tone. She'd heard it 1,000 times before. The angry voice rose again. "Do you know who I am? I'm Hans Hartmann. I'm VP of Operations for Sartori Industrial, and I have a critical board meeting in Milan at 900. I cannot be delayed." Elena exchanged a glance with Thomas. "Here we go," she murmured. Every flight seemed to have won the self-important passenger who believed their needs superseded everyone else's, including the laws of physics and meteorology. Maria appeared at the cockpit door a few moments later, her professional smile slightly strained. "We have a gentleman in 4B who's making his presence known, Hans Hartmann. He's upset about his seat assignment, upset that we don't have the breakfast option he wanted, and has already informed me twice about his important meeting in Milan." "Duly noted," Elena said dryly. "Is he compliant for departure?" "Oh yes, he's seated and belted, just vocal." Maria lowered her voice slightly. "He's also been rude to Mrs. Tedesco. The elderly lady in 23C, she accidentally brushed his shoulder walking to her seat, and he made quite a scene about it. She apologized 3 times. Poor thing. She's anxious enough without that." Elena felt a flash of anger. She'd encountered men like Hartmann throughout her career, men who wore their importance like armor, who treated flight attendants like servants and other passengers like obstacles. In the early days of her career, such men had made it clear they didn't think women belonged in the cockpit. She'd proven them wrong 34 years' worth of flights at a time. "If he causes any problems, let me know immediately," Elena said. "And check on Mrs. Tedesco. Make sure she knows we're going to get her to her appointment." "Will do, Captain." Maria returned to the cabin. The boarding process completed, and Elena received the final load sheet from the gate agent. They were carrying 4,800 kilograms of fuel, enough for the flight to Milan plus the required reserves and enough extra to reach their alternates if needed. The weight and balance were within limits. Everything was ready. Swiss 1630, Zurich ground, you're cleared to push and start runway 14, COGUVA 4 Alpha departure. Cleared to push and start runway 14, COGUVA 4 Alpha, Swiss 1630, Elena acknowledged. She nodded to Thomas. Your leg. You'll be pilot flying. My leg, I have control, Thomas confirmed, placing his hands on the side stick. The tug pushed them back from gate E58, and Thomas started the engines, a smooth, quiet process on the A220, nothing like the thunderous spooling of older jets. Within minutes, they were taxiing toward the runway, the aircraft light and responsive on the ground. During the taxi, Elena pulled up the latest weather for Milan again. Her stomach tightened. METAR now shows visibility 800 meters, fog developing. That's getting close to minimums. Thomas glanced over, his young face showing concern. Should we take extra fuel? It was a good question, the kind that showed he was thinking ahead. We already have enough for 2 approaches plus alternates. If it goes below minimums, we'll divert to Linate. It's only 15 miles east, and their weather is holding better. They reached the runway, received their takeoff clearance, and Thomas advanced the thrust levers. The Pratt & Whitney engines wound up with their characteristic muted roar, and the A220 accelerated down runway 14 with the smooth power that made the type such a joy to fly. Elena called out airspeeds. 80 knots, checked. V1, rotate. And Thomas lifted the nose precisely at the calculated rotation speed of 137 knots. I have a board meeting at 900, and I need your guarantee that we'll land in Milan on time. If we divert, Elena cut him off. Mr. Hartman, I don't make guarantees about weather, and I don't fly airplanes based on your meeting schedule. I fly based on safety regulations and minimums. Now please return to your seat, or we'll have a different conversation with security when we land. She released the button before he could respond, then called Maria. Is he back in his seat? Yes, Captain. He grabbed the phone off the wall before I could stop him. I'm so sorry. Not your fault. How's Mrs. Tedesco? She's calmer now. I gave her some water and had a chat. She told me about her appointment. She has an irregular heartbeat that's been getting worse, and the specialist at San Rafael is the best in Italy. She's been waiting 3 months for this consultation. She's terrified they won't reschedule if she misses it. Elena closed her eyes briefly. The weight of responsibility settled heavier on her shoulders. I'll do everything I can to get her there, Maria, but I need you to understand, if we're not safe to land, we're diverting. She'll be rescheduled. Tell her that if we go to Linate instead, Swiss will arrange ground transportation to the hospital. She'll make her appointment either way. I'll tell her. Thank you, Elena. As they descended through 20,000 feet, Elena studied the weather radar. The fog bank over Milan was massive, a gray-white blob that covered the entire metropolitan area. This was radiation fog, formed overnight when clear skies allowed the ground to cool rapidly, condensing moisture in the air above the Po Valley. It was the worst kind of fog for aviation, thick, persistent, and unpredictable. Milan approach, Swiss 1630, descending to flight level 110. Swiss 1630, descend to 6,000 feet, reduce speed to 220 knots, vectors for the ILS runway 35 right. Current RVR is 350 meters and holding. You'll be number 2 for the approach, following an Emirates 777 that's 3 miles ahead. 350 meters, right at their minimums, but still legal. Elena felt the tension ratcheting up in her chest. She'd flown thousands of approaches in her career, but fog approaches never got routine. There was always that moment of truth at minimums when you either saw the runway or you didn't, when skill and technology gave way to simple visibility. Thomas, set up for the approach. I'm taking control. You have control, Thomas acknowledged, his hands coming off the side stick. Elena's fingers wrapped around her side stick, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch. The A220 was smooth in her hands, the fly-by-wire system translating her inputs into precise adjustments. Flight directors on, autopilot to approach mode, autoland armed. Approach mode armed, autoland armed, Thomas confirmed, watching the flight mode enunciator. Localizer alive, glide slope alive. The autopilot captured the ILS signal, and the aircraft began tracking toward the runway with computer precision. Elena kept her hands and feet lightly on the controls, monitoring but not interfering. The enhanced vision system on her primary flight display activated, showing the infrared image of the terrain below. It was like looking through murky green water, shapes and outlines visible, but nothing clear. Swiss 1630, contact Tower 118.7. Elena switched frequencies. Tower, Swiss 1630, established on the ILS 35 right. Swiss 1630, Malpensa Tower, wind calm, RVR now 300 meters, cleared to land runway 35 right. Be advised, Emirates ahead of you is going around, did not acquire visual. Elena's stomach dropped. The Emirates had missed the approach. A 777 had better visibility from its higher cockpit. If they couldn't see the runway, what chance did the smaller A220 have? Should we divert now? Thomas asked, his voice tight. Elena watched the altimeter wind down, 3,000 feet. They were committed to the approach now. It was safer to continue than to try to break off at this altitude in these conditions. We continue to minimums. One approach, and if we don't see it, we go to Linate. Behind them, she knew Maria would be making the cabin announcement. Flight attendants prepare for landing. Mrs. Tedesco would be gripping her armrests, praying they'd land in Milan. Hans Hartmann would be checking his watch, fuming about delays. 2,000 feet. The autopilot guided them down the invisible slope with perfect precision. Elena's eyes scanned the instruments in the pattern she'd trained herself to follow for 34 years. Airspeed, altitude, localizer, glide slope. Green, green, centered, centered, all perfect. 1,000 feet. Minimums in 1,000 feet, Thomas called, his job now to back her up, to call out deviations, to be her second set of eyes. In the cabin, Maria moved through her silent routine, checking seatbelts, securing galleys, preparing for either a landing or a go-around. She paused at row 23, where Mrs. Tedesco sat with her eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Maria squeezed the elderly woman's shoulder gently. 700 feet. The world outside was completely gray now, a void of fog pressing against the windscreen. The enhanced vision system showed ghost images, the ground getting closer, but no runway, no lights, nothing concrete. 500 feet, Thomas called. The radio crackled. Swiss 1630 RVR now dropping to 280 meters. Below minimums. They were below minimums. Elena's hand moved toward the thrust levers, ready to execute the go-around, but she held off. They still had altitude. Sometimes the visibility improved right at the surface, where the fog was thinner. 300 feet. No visual, Elena said, her voice steady, but her heart was pounding. Mrs. Tedesco needed to get to Milan, but Elena had 137 lives in her hands, and no meeting, no appointment, no schedule was worth a single one of them. 200 feet, minimums. Elena's eyes locked on the windscreen, willing the fog to part. The enhanced vision system showed a faint outline of what might be approach lights, but she couldn't verify it. Company policy was clear. They needed actual visual contact with the runway environment to continue below minimums. No visual contact, she announced. Her hand moved to the thrust levers. Going around, TOGA. She pressed the takeoff go-around buttons, and the engines spooled up with a surge of power. The nose pitched up, the autopilot commanding a positive rate of climb. Positive rate, Thomas called. Gear up. The landing gear retracted with a thunk, and the A220 climbed back into the fog. Elena's jaw was set. They'd done everything right, followed every procedure, but the weather had won this round. Swiss 1630 going around, she transmitted. Roger, Swiss 1630, climb to 5,000, turn left heading 280. As they climbed through 1,000 feet, Elena pulled up the approach chart for Linate Airport on her iPad. 15 miles to the east, Linate's weather was showing 800 meters visibility, not great, but legally landable. They had enough fuel to hold for 10 minutes, shoot one approach at Linate, and still have reserve fuel if that didn't work out. The intercom chimed urgently. Elena pressed the button. Cockpit. Captain, we have a problem. Maria's voice was tight. Mrs. Tedesco is having chest pains. She says it feels like pressure, radiating to her arm. I've got her on oxygen, and my crew is monitoring her, but she needs medical attention as soon as possible. Elena's mind raced. Chest pain radiating to the arm, classic signs of a cardiac event. How bad is she? Conscious, coherent, but clearly in distress. She's terrified she's going to die before seeing the specialist. The weight of command had never felt heavier. Elena had a medical emergency developing in the cabin, an airport below minimums behind her, and a challenging approach ahead at an alternate field. Every instinct told her to get this aircraft on the ground immediately, but every regulation told her she couldn't legally land where she'd just tried. Keep her calm and on oxygen. We're diverting to Linate now. ETA 12 minutes. She switched back to approach control. Malpensa approach, Swiss 1630, we're declaring a medical emergency. We need priority handling for immediate diversion to Linate. Swiss 1630, Roger, medical emergency declared. Squawk 7700, you're cleared direct Linate. Descend to 4,000 feet. I'm coordinating with Linate Tower now. Souls on board and fuel remaining. 137 souls, 4,000 kilograms fuel, Elena reported. The squawk code 7700 would light up their aircraft on every air traffic controller's radar screen as an emergency. Priority handling meant other traffic would be moved aside. It also meant paperwork, questions, and scrutiny, but Mrs. Tedesco's life was more important than bureaucratic inconvenience. Nature of the medical emergency, the controller asked. Elderly passenger with chest pain, possible cardiac event. Understood, Swiss 1630. Linate has been notified. They're rolling emergency equipment, and there will be an ambulance standing by. Thomas had already reprogrammed the flight management system for Linate. Direct track to Linate programmed, ILS runway 36 selected. Linate weather is visibility 800 meters, ceiling 300 feet, temperature -2, runway is clear and dry. It would have to be good enough. Elena began a descent, the fog still surrounding them in an impenetrable gray cocoon. At 4,000 feet, they broke out of the fog layer, and suddenly the world returned, the Po Valley stretching below them, lights of small towns visible, and in the distance, the faint glow of Milan's eastern suburbs. Then Hans Hartmann's voice came over the cabin speakers. He'd somehow gotten access to the PA system. This is unacceptable. The pilots are diverting us away from Milan when we could have landed. I demand we return to Malpensa immediately. I have a critical, sir, get away from that panel. Maria's voice, sharp and commanding. There was a scuffle, sounds of a brief struggle. Elena's anger flared white-hot. Thomas, get Maria on the intercom now. A moment later. Captain, I'm so sorry. He pushed past me and grabbed the PA handset. We've got him secured now, but he's threatening lawsuits, threatening to have us all fired. He's saying we faked the medical emergency to cover for pilot incompetence. Elena took a breath, forcing herself to speak calmly. Is Mrs. Tedesco stable? Yes, still conscious, still in pain, but stable on oxygen. Good. Tell Mr. Hartmann he's being met by police in Linate. He's violated multiple regulations by accessing cockpit equipment and interfering with crew duties during a medical emergency. He can explain himself to the authorities. She switched back to Linate approach. Linate Tower, Swiss 1630, 12 miles northwest, medical emergency inbound. Swiss 1630, Linate Tower, you're cleared ILS approach runway 36, wind 040 at 5 knots, visibility 800 meters in mist, cleared to land. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Expect progressive taxi instructions after landing to meet the ambulance. 800 meters. Not great, but legal. More importantly, it was above minimums. They could do this approach. Elena armed the approach mode again, watching the localizer and glide slope needles come alive as they intercepted the ILS signal for Linate's runway 36. Flaps 2, Elena called. Thomas moved the flap lever. Gear down. The landing gear extended with a reassuring thunk and locked. 3 green lights on the gear indicator. Gear down and locked, Thomas confirmed. They descended through 3,000 feet, the lights of Linate Airport appearing ahead through the mist. Elena could see the approach light system, a string of white lights leading to the runway threshold. Visual contact, she announced, a wave of relief washing over her. Continue approach, Thomas confirmed. At 500 feet, the runway was clearly visible, a long strip of asphalt stretching ahead, lights marking its edges, and beyond it, the red flashing lights of emergency vehicles waiting on the taxiway. Elena disconnected the autopilot and took manual control, feeling the aircraft respond to her touch. 200 feet, Thomas called. 100, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. Elena brought the thrust levers to idle and raised the nose slightly, flaring for landing. The main wheels kissed the runway with barely a chirp, and she lowered the nose wheel gently. "Thrust reversers," she commanded, and Thomas deployed them, the engines howling as they slowed the aircraft. "Nice landing, Captain," Thomas said quietly. "Thanks." Elena steered the A220 off the runway at the first taxiway, following the progressive taxi lights. A follow-me car appeared, leading them to a remote parking position where an ambulance waited, its lights flashing. She set the parking brake and started the shutdown procedure. "Thomas, you secure the aircraft. I'm going back to check on Mrs. Tedesco." Elena unbuckled and left the cockpit, entering the cabin. The passengers were mostly quiet, some confused, some anxious. She walked quickly to row 23 where Maria was kneeling beside Mrs. Tedesco. The elderly woman's face was pale, but she was conscious, an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. "Mrs. Tedesco," Elena said gently, crouching down beside her. "I'm Captain Marchetti. The ambulance is right outside. We're going to get you to San Rafael Hospital. You're going to make your appointment." The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears. She pulled the oxygen mask aside. "Thank you," she whispered in Italian-accented English. I thought I would die before seeing the doctor." "Not on my watch," Elena said firmly. She looked up at Maria. "Let's get the door open for the paramedics." As Maria moved to open the forward door, Elena stood and found herself face to face with Hans Hartmann. He was red-faced, his expensive suit rumpled from his scuffle with the flight attendants. "This is outrageous," he started. "I'm going to file a complaint with Swiss management, with the aviation authorities," with Elena held up a hand, her voice quiet but hard as steel. "Mr. Hartmann, you interfered with flight crew during an emergency. You accessed cockpit equipment without authorization. You harassed a passenger who is now being treated for a cardiac event. The police are waiting to speak with you. I suggest you think very carefully about your next words." His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. For perhaps the first time in a very long time, Hans Hartmann had nothing to say. The paramedics came aboard with a stretcher, and Elena supervised as they carefully moved Mrs. Tedesco. The elderly woman reached out and grasped Elena's hand. "You saved my life," she said. "I'm a pilot," Elena replied gently. "This is what we do." As the paramedics wheeled Mrs. Tedesco away, Elena watched through the window. 2 police officers were climbing the stairs to the aircraft. She pointed them toward Hans Hartmann, who was suddenly very interested in becoming small and invisible. The rest of the deplaning was smooth. Most passengers were understanding once Maria explained the situation. Swiss operations arranged buses to take them the 15 miles to Milan Malpensa for their connections. A few thanked Elena personally as they left. One elderly gentleman, wearing a veteran's pin on his jacket, shook her hand. "That was real flying, Captain." "The kind we did in my day, making the hard decisions, putting people first." An hour later, after dealing with the authorities and filing the required emergency reports, Elena and Thomas sat in the Linate operations office, waiting for the fog at Malpensa to clear so they could reposition the aircraft. Thomas was quiet, processing everything that had happened. "I froze up there," he finally said. "When you asked if we should divert earlier, I couldn't decide. I was scared." Elena looked at her young first officer. "Fear is natural. I was scared too. I've been flying for 34 years and I still get scared on approaches like that. The difference is you can't let fear make your decisions for you. You train, you follow procedures, and you trust your judgment." "But how did you know to keep trying at Malpensa? Another 200 feet and we would have landed." "I didn't know," Elena said simply. "That's the point. We reached minimums without visual contact, so we went around. There's no shame in that. There's no prize for landing when you can't see the runway. Every time I land safely, every time my passengers walk away, that's the prize." Her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. "It's from our operations center. Mrs. Tedesco arrived at San Rafael Hospital. The chest pain was severe angina, not a full cardiac arrest. They've got her stabilized and the specialist is seeing her now." "She's going to be fine." Thomas let out a breath he'd been holding. "We really did save her life, didn't we?" "We did our job," Elena corrected gently. "But yes, we did." 2 hours later, the fog at Malpensa had lifted enough for VFR conditions, and they repositioned the empty A220 back to its original destination. As Elena guided the aircraft down through clear air toward runway 35 right, the same runway she'd missed in the fog, she could see the entire airport spread below her, bathed in morning sunlight. It looked nothing like the gray void she'd faced earlier. After parking at the gate, Elena walked through the terminal to the airport administration office, where she'd been asked to meet with the duty manager. She expected routine debriefing about the emergency, but when she entered the office, she found a small group waiting. The duty manager, a representative from Swiss headquarters, and to her surprise, Mrs. Giuliana Tedesco, sitting in a wheelchair, wearing a hospital gown under a coat with an IV still attached to her arm. "Mrs. Tedesco," Elena approached quickly. "Should you be out of the hospital?" The elderly woman smiled, her color much better than it had been on the aircraft. "The doctor said I could come for a few minutes with the nurse." She nodded to a young woman in scrubs standing beside her. "I had to come thank you properly. You see, my husband Antonio flew for Alitalia for 30 years. He died 5 years ago, but he would have been so proud of how you flew today. Real flying, he would have said. The kind where the pilot's judgment matters more than all the computers." Elena felt a lump forming in her throat. "Your husband was a pilot." "Captain on the DC-9, then the MD-80. He loved it. When I was nervous about flying after he died, he made me promise I would never stop. He said as long as there were pilots like him in the cockpit, I would always be safe." She reached out and took Elena's hand. "You kept his promise. You kept me safe." The Swiss representative stepped forward, a young man in a corporate suit. "Captain Marchetti, headquarters wanted me to convey their appreciation for your handling of today's situation. Your decision-making was exemplary. Going around at Malpensa, declaring the emergency, landing at Linate, everything was by the book, but also showed exceptional judgment. We're also dealing with Mr. Hartmann. He's been charged by the Italian authorities, and Swiss will be pursuing its own internal investigation. You won't be hearing from him again." Elena nodded. "I was just doing my job." "That's what the best pilots always say," the duty manager added. "But we know better. You had a lot of pressure up there, whether a medical emergency, a disruptive passenger. Lesser pilots might have made different choices." After the meeting, Elena walked Mrs. Tedesco back to the waiting ambulance. "What did the specialist say?" she asked. "He says I need a pacemaker," Mrs. Tedesco replied. "The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow. Without today's appointment, without the tests they did, he says I might have had a massive heart attack within days." She looked up at Elena. "You really did save my life, Captain, not just by landing the plane, but by getting me here." They reached the ambulance, and the nurse helped Mrs. Tedesco inside. Before the doors closed, the elderly woman called out, "Captain, my Antonio always said there were 2 kinds of pilots, the ones who fly airplanes and the ones who are airplanes. He said the great ones don't just operate the machine, they become one with it, they feel what it needs, they know when to trust it and when to take control. Today, you were the airplane. I could feel it." The doors closed, and the ambulance drove away toward the hospital. Elena stood watching until it disappeared from view. That evening, after finally making it back to Zurich on a deadhead flight, Elena drove to her apartment in the old town. She was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from hours of intense concentration and emotional strain. But she was also filled with something else, a renewed sense of purpose, of why she'd fought so hard to be a pilot all those years ago. Her phone rang as she was unlocking her door. Sophia, her daughter. "Mom, I heard about your flight. It's all over the aviation news sites. Swiss pilot saves passenger during fog emergency." "Are you okay?" Elena smiled. "I'm fine, sweetheart." "Tired, but fine. Tell me what happened." Over the next hour, Elena recounted the whole story, the fog, the approach, the medical emergency, the difficult landing at Linate. Sophia listened with the intense focus she'd inherited from her mother, asking technical questions, wanting to understand every decision. "But weren't you scared?" Sophia finally asked. "When you couldn't see the runway?" "Terrified," Elena admitted. "But fear is just information. It tells you the stakes are high, that you need to be careful, that you need to trust your training. It doesn't tell you to quit." "That's what you always taught me," Sophia said softly. "When I was in medical school, when I had those patients who were so sick I didn't think I could help them, I remembered what you said. Fear is just information." They talked a while longer about life and work and the ways their professions were similar high stakes, quick decisions, lives depending on their skill and judgment. Before they hung up, Sophia said, I'm proud of you, Mom. You're the reason I became a doctor. I wanted to save lives like you do. After the call ended, Elena sat in her darkened apartment, looking out at the lights of Zurich. She thought about Mrs. Tedesco, about the look in the elderly woman's eyes when she'd said, "You saved my life." She thought about Hans Hartmann, about the kind of man who valued his meeting over someone else's life. She thought about Thomas, still learning that being a good pilot meant making hard choices. And she thought about all the flights ahead of her, all the passengers who would trust her with their lives, all the times she would sit in that left seat and take responsibility for bringing them safely home. The next morning, Elena was back at the crew briefing room, preparing for another flight. The dispatcher greeted her with a smile. "Morning, Captain. Saw the reports from yesterday. Nice job." "Just another day," Elena replied, but she was smiling. Thomas arrived, looking more confident than he had the previous morning. "Ready for today?" he asked. "Always," Elena said. "What do we have?" "Milan Malpensa," Thomas replied with a grin. "Weather is severe, clear, visibility unlimited." Elena laughed. "Of course it is. Let's go." As they walked to the aircraft, a different A220 this time, but the same type, the same wonderful machine, Elena felt the familiar sense of purpose settle over her shoulders. This was who she was. This was what she did. 34 years of flying, and she was nowhere near done. On the aircraft, Maria was waiting. "Morning, Captain. Heard you're famous now." "Hardly," Elena said. "How's the load today?" "Light, 90 passengers, all healthy, all polite." Maria paused. "Though we do have someone who specifically requested to meet you before departure. She's waiting in the gate area." Curious, Elena walked back through the jet bridge. Standing near the gate desk was a woman in her 30s, wearing a medical coat. She approached Elena nervously. "Captain Marchetti, I'm Dr. Sylvia Kant from San Rafael Hospital. I was the specialist who saw Mrs. Tedesco yesterday." "Is she all right?" Elena asked immediately. "She's excellent. The pacemaker surgery went perfectly, and she's recovering well, but she wanted me to give you this." Dr. Kant handed Elena an envelope. "She insisted I fly to Zurich today to deliver it personally." Elena opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note in slightly shaky script. "Dear Captain Marchetti, my Antonio always said that flying was an act of faith, faith in the aircraft, faith in the training, but most of all, faith in the pilot. Yesterday, you honored that faith. You brought me safely to Earth when the sky was blind. You made the hard decision to try again elsewhere when the first way wouldn't work. You put my life ahead of schedules and convenience. The doctors say I have many more years ahead of me now. I will spend them grateful for what you did. Antonio would have wanted me to tell you something he always said. The sky doesn't care about your experience or your credentials. It only cares whether you respect it. You respect it, Captain. That's why you're great at what you do. There's something else in the envelope. It was Antonio's. He would have wanted you to have it." With eternal gratitude, Giuliana Tedesco, Elena reached into the envelope and pulled out a small pin, a set of golden pilot's wings from Alitalia, old style, the kind they didn't make anymore. They were worn smooth from years of being worn on a uniform, and they were the most beautiful thing Elena had ever seen. "She insisted," Dr. Kant said. "She said Antonio would have given them to you himself if he'd been there." Elena's eyes were wet. She clutched the wings tightly. "Thank you for bringing these." "Thank you for saving her life," Dr. Kant replied. "She's going to dance at her granddaughter's wedding next month. She was afraid she'd never see it." After Dr. Kant left, Elena stood for a moment, looking at the wings in her palm. Then she pinned them carefully to her uniform jacket, right above her own Swiss wings. Old and new, different airlines, but the same profession, the same calling. She returned to the cockpit where Thomas was completing the pre-flight checks. He noticed the new pin immediately. "Where did that come from?" Elena told him the story. When she finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's what it's all about, isn't it? Not the procedures or the technology, the people." "The people," Elena agreed. "Always the people." They pushed back from the gate and taxied to the runway. The weather was indeed perfect, clear blue skies, unlimited visibility, gentle winds. The kind of day when flying was pure joy instead of intense concentration. Thomas handled the takeoff smoothly, and the A220 climbed into the morning air, turning south toward Italy. As Zurich fell away behind them and the Alps appeared ahead, Elena thought about the previous day's flight. The fog, the mist approach, the medical emergency, the difficult decisions. She thought about how close it had all come to going differently, how many small choices had added up to a good outcome. She thought about Mrs. Tedesco, recovering in a hospital in Milan, wearing a new pacemaker and looking forward to her granddaughter's wedding. She thought about the words Antonio Tedesco had lived by. The sky doesn't care about your experience or your credentials. It only cares whether you respect it. Elena respected it. She had for 34 years, and she would until her last flight. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. The understanding that aviation was a partnership between human and machine, between pilot and sky, between experience and humility. The ones who forgot that, who thought their credentials made them invincible, were the ones who got into trouble. "Captain," Thomas's voice broke through her thoughts. "Did you hear from authorities about Hans Hartmann?" "I got an email this morning," Elena replied. "He's been charged with interfering with a flight crew, and Swiss has banned him from flying with us for 5 years. He's also facing a civil lawsuit from Mrs. Tedesco's family. Turns out his critical board meeting was to argue for closing a factory in southern Italy, would have cost 200 people their jobs. The board went ahead and fired him instead." "Karma," Thomas said quietly. "Something like that." They flew on in comfortable silence, the autopilot guiding them along the programmed route. Elena monitored the systems, but her mind was elsewhere, thinking about the nature of command. All those years ago, when that captain had asked if she could handle an airliner, she'd been angry. Now, looking back, she understood something she couldn't have known then. Handling an airliner wasn't just about manipulating the controls. It was about making decisions when the answers weren't clear. It was about balancing competing pressures: safety, schedule, passenger needs, regulations. It was about knowing when to be flexible and when to be rigid, when to trust the automation and when to take over manually, when to continue and when to quit. Most of all, it was about understanding that every flight was a sacred trust. 137 people or 90 people or 200 people, or however many were in the cabin, had entrusted her with the most precious thing they had: their lives. That trust was never routine, never casual. It was renewed with every flight, and it demanded her best effort every single time. "Milan approach, Swiss 1622, level at flight level 200, Thomas transmitted. "Swiss 1622, Milan approach, good morning. Descend to flight level 150 and welcome back. We have your handling notes from yesterday. Nice job." Even the controllers remembered. Elena smiled slightly. Aviation was a small community in many ways. Word traveled fast, especially about incidents that ended well. As they descended toward Milan, Elena could see the airport clearly in the distance. No fog today, just clear air and good visibility. She thought about how different this approach would be from yesterday's, how the same runway could be visible or invisible depending on weather. It was a reminder that conditions changed constantly, that what worked yesterday might not work today. That flexibility was essential. "Swiss 1622, cleared for ILS approach, runway 35 right, wind 030 at 8 knots. "Cleared for the approach, Swiss 1622. Thomas flew the approach smoothly, the A220 tracking down the glide slope with precision. At 1,000 feet, the runway was clearly visible ahead. At 500 feet, Elena could see individual markings on the pavement. At 200 feet, they could have been landing in broad daylight in the middle of summer. The landing was smooth, and they taxied to the same gate they'd departed from the day before. As they shut down the engines, Elena thought about the circular nature of it, leaving here in fog, returning in clarity. It felt like a metaphor for something, though she wasn't sure what. In the terminal, a gate agent approached Elena. "Captain Marchetti, there's someone who'd like to see you. We've got her in the crew lounge." Elena followed the agent, wondering who it could be. The crew lounge door opened, and there sat Mrs. Giuliana Tedesco, this time in a wheelchair but wearing street clothes, looking healthy and strong. Her daughter, a woman in her 50s, stood beside her, and next to her daughter was a younger woman, perhaps 25, who could only be the granddaughter. "Captain," Mrs. Tedesco exclaimed. "I heard you were flying to Milan today. I wanted you to meet my family." Elena's heart swelled. "Mrs. Tedesco, you should be resting." "I've rested enough." "Captain, this is my daughter Rosa, and this is my granddaughter Lucia. Lucia, this is the pilot I told you about." Lucia stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for saving my Nana. Our wedding is in 3 weeks and she's going to be there because of you." "I'm going to dance," Mrs. Tedesco said firmly. "The doctor says I shouldn't, but I'm going to anyway. Life is too short not to dance at your granddaughter's wedding." They talked for 20 minutes, and Elena learned that Antonio Tedesco had flown the Milan-Rome route for most of his career, that he'd taught both his daughter and granddaughter to love aviation, that the family still attended air shows and aviation events in his memory. They told stories about his career, about the time he'd landed an MD-80 with one engine shut down in a thunderstorm, about the Christmas flights where he'd worn a Santa hat in the cockpit. "He would have loved meeting you," Rosa said. "He always said there weren't enough women pilots, that aviation needed more people who flew with heart instead of just ego." When it was time to leave, Mrs. Tedesco grasped both of Elena's hands. "You have his wings now. Wear them with pride. You've earned them 1,000 times over." "I'll treasure them," Elena promised. As the family left, Elena stood in the quiet crew lounge for a moment, touching the old Alitalia wings on her jacket. She thought about Antonio Tedesco, who she'd never met but felt like she knew. She thought about all the pilots who'd come before her, who'd faced their own fogs and emergencies and impossible choices, who'd made the same commitment she had, to bring their passengers safely home. That evening, back in Zurich after a routine return flight, Elena sat in her favorite cafe near the old town, watching the pedestrians pass on the cobblestone streets. Her phone buzzed with a message from the Swiss chief pilot's office. "Captain Marchetti, please call to schedule a meeting next week. We have a proposal for you regarding the A220 training program." She smiled. They probably wanted her to help develop procedures for low-visibility approaches or to mentor new captains transitioning to type. She'd do it, of course. Passing on knowledge was part of the profession, part of the sacred trust. Another message arrived, this one from Thomas. "Captain, thank you for everything you taught me yesterday and today. I want to be the kind of pilot you are." "TW," Elena typed back. "You're already on your way. Keep learning, keep respecting the sky, and never forget why we do this." She ordered another coffee and pulled out her iPad, reviewing the technical manuals for the A220's Autoland system. There was always more to learn, always ways to improve, always preparation for the next challenge. 34 years of experience didn't make you invincible. It made you aware of how much could go wrong and how important it was to stay sharp. As the evening deepened and the lights of Zurich began to glow in the dusk, Elena thought about the question Thomas had asked. "Weren't you scared?" Yes, she'd been scared. She was scared on every low-visibility approach, every time weather turned bad, every time an unexpected situation developed. Fear kept you sharp. Fear reminded you of the stakes. Fear was the price of caring. But fear didn't control her. Training did. Procedures did. Experience did. And underneath all of that, the simple commitment she'd made decades ago, to honor the trust placed in her, to respect the sky, to bring her passengers safely home. She touched the Alitalia wings on her jacket one more time, thinking of Antonio Tedesco, thinking of all the pilots who'd worn these wings before, thinking of the legacy she was part of. Then she paid her bill, gathered her things, and walked home through the old streets of Zurich, ready for whatever tomorrow's flights would bring. Because that was what pilots did. They showed up, they did the job, they made the hard decisions, and they brought their passengers safely home. Day after day, flight after flight, fog or sunshine, emergency or routine. It was the greatest privilege Elena had ever known. And somewhere in Milan, an elderly woman with a new pacemaker was planning what dress to wear to her granddaughter's wedding, thinking about a foggy morning when a pilot she'd never met had made the right choices at the right times, had honored the sacred trust, had brought her safely home. The sky hadn't cared about Elena's experience or credentials that morning. It had only cared whether she respected it, and she had. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.